afternoon, everyone. And I bet it's gorgeous outside, right? I haven't been outside since 8:30 this morning, so I can't wait to go back outside later today. My name is Candace Summers. I am the Senior Director of Education here at the museum, and I'm your program today, too. But before we get into all these amazing women I have to share, I do want to thank our live stream sponsor, which is a special thank you to WGLT, Bloomington Normal's public media radio station, part of the NPR network, and also our Lunch and Learn sponsor, which is MCK Finances and Accountants. Without them, we wouldn't be able to do programs like this, especially during the lunchtime, and also record the program for those of us who can't join us in person or for those who are live streamed at home. I will remind everybody that unless you wanted to live on the internet forever, mind your P's and Q's here in the room, because it will be recorded and put on our YouTube page for later. But you all look like a good bunch of people that keep it clean, so. So a little kind of background information about this program. Back in 2020, before the world shut down, I had been thinking about, we need a women's history program. You know, we need something that talks about all these fantastic women that are in McLean County history, a lot of whom I knew and got to know because of the Evergreen Cemetery Walk. And also that was the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage amendment passing. So what better time than to celebrate women's history? Well, then the world had other ideas for us. But that gave me the time to do the research on a lot of these fantastic women. So in 2021, I debuted this program with 20 women. And now over time, I think I'm up to almost 30 women that I can kind of rotate in and out of my presentation. And particularly this year, I have 5 different ladies that we just completed research on, who are also in our rotunda display. If you come here to the museum, you can see our rotunda display on the first and second floors that feature 30 women from our local history. And there's so many more women that we could include in all the things here, more than I have time to do a presentation on today. But you can find a lot of that information on our website, mchistory.org, if you want to snoop around there later on. But also, this program is a long time coming because a lot of women are kind of in the shadows in local history. You know, you're known as your father's daughter. You're known as your husband's wife. You know, when you try to track women through the historical documents, you know, you're Mrs. Tom Smith, or you're, you know, Candace Summers is John Hansen's daughter, or it's hard to track women, and unless you have a lot of money, a lot of times you weren't reported on in the newspaper. And so as we were digging through our records, we were trying to find women who'd been marginalized, who had been forgotten. You know, people like Belle Blue Claxton, a woman of color, who worked hard to try and desegregate the beaches at Miller Park, and also types of employment, the ability to own property, voting rights, laws and traditions. They determined what women could do, you know, until the modern era. And also women's accomplishments were downplayed. Who invented the game of Monopoly? Who can tell me? It was a woman. It was not a man. It was Elizabeth Maggie, but Charles Darrow gets the credit for inventing Monopoly. Her game was originally called the Landlord's Game, so look it up. And so I've tried to compile a nice cross-section of women from McLean County history to share some of these stories with you. I had a hard time picking which women to include today, so I'm going to try to get through all of them because I do have 13 to share, so I will do my best. But I will kick it off with one of the earliest female physicians here in McLean County, Dr. Marie Louise Depew Crothers, and she is believed to have been the first female physician in Bloomington. She established her own practice at a time when very few women had achieved that level of mastery within the profession. She was born in Indianapolis in 1833, and her family moved to Bloomington when she was 7. But little is known about her until she got married to Dr. Eli Crothers in 1851. Her husband, Eli, was a doctor and earned a reputation as one of the more capable eye doctors around central Illinois. Louise and Eli had 9 children, but only 4 of whom survived to adulthood, including their daughter, Rachel Crothers, who is also equally famous. Louise's mother, E.K., fostered her own interest in medicine. When she was 40, you're never too old to learn new things and establish a new career, I'm here to tell you. When she was 40, she began to educate herself by reading Gray's Anatomy and assisting Eli in his practice. She began her studies at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia from 1877 to 78. And at that time, women were not allowed to attend medical school with men. They had their own medical schools, and only a few of them throughout the country. She continued additional studies at the Women's Medical College of Chicago and took special medical courses in gynecology at Rush Medical College of Chicago. And when she returned to Bloomington, Dr. Louise Crothers established a successful practice apart from her husband, earning the reputation as, quote, the acknowledged leading lady physician of Central Illinois, but reportedly met with a good deal of opposition in pursuit of her professional endeavors, because at that time, who wants to go to a lady physician? In 1887, the Doctors Crothers, as they were sometimes called, moved to a residence at 414 East Jefferson Street. Louise kept an office at the family home where she treated diseases of women and children and handled obstetric cases. I mean, how revolutionary at that time to actually have a woman doctor helping you if you were pregnant and getting ready to have a baby. Almost unheard of at that time. And Louise's experience in gynecology and obstetrics made her invaluable when that was such a taboo topic of the period. As her husband Eli's health declined due to diabetes, she took on a larger part of responsibilities in the practice, aiding her husband very materially in his office. And when he died in the spring of 1893, after losing his battle to diabetes, she took over both practices and managed them on her own. The last 4 years of her professional practice was spent being the first attending physician of the Women's Industrial Home, later renamed the Girls' Industrial Home. The home was first located in a rented house at 807 West Market Street, the site of Mount Pisgah Baptist Church today. And when she died in 1920, the Pantograph remembered her as being, quote, devoted to her home and family, and her heart and soul were dedicated to the welfare of her children. Her death marks the passing of one of the city's most lovable characters, a woman whose memory will be cherished wherever she was known. And the picture on the screen, Edwards School was also at that site of that first home as well, where Mount Pisgah is today. A woman connected to the Girls' Industrial Home was Lucy Orme Morgan, who was born in 1858 in Bloomington to William and Nanny Orme. And again, not much is known about her life until she got married, but she graduated and attended the Monticello Ladies Seminary, which was a finishing school near Godfrey, Illinois, in 1877, and she was the salutatorian of her class. 3 years after graduating, she married Edward R. Morgan in 1880 in Bloomington, and they had 3 children, Richard, Nan, and Frank. And Lucy was very active in the community. Her passion was social service and hoped to help others, especially young people, become independent and successful. And she was also a firm believer in women's suffrage. Among the organizations she belonged to, she was a charter member of the McLean County chapter of the Red Cross, a member of the Bureau of Social Services, a history club, served on the Brokaw Hospital Board, and was a member and co-founder of the Bloomington Women's Club in 1897, which still exists to this day. But what her passion and what would become the most distinguishable part of her life was the Girls' Industrial Home. The home, as I mentioned, was first the Women's Industrial Home of McLean County, was founded in 1889, and that home was located where Mount Pisgah Church is, 807 West Market Street. But it was not a home for delinquent children. Rather, it was a home for dependent children white children only at that time, who were neglected and had no one to care for them. The home was a place where they could both live and get a useful education. The girls would be taught useful things to prepare them for a life of independence when they turned of age. It's not exactly known when she became involved in the home, but it's most likely due to her work with the Women's Club, because that was a charity that the Women's Club supported. But she was elected board president of the home in 1906, and she helped the home grow and thrive, leading successful campaigns to expand and improve the home to continue to meet the needs of its residents. And that's a later version of the building on the screen at 403 South State Street. A lot of people probably remember when it was the Morgan Washington home in the 50s and 60s at that same location. In August of 1929, the board of the home honored Lucy for her 24 years as president of the board and her faithful service to the girls' industrial home by renaming it the Lucy Orme Morgan Home for Girls. And in 1939, Lucy declined re-election as president of the board of the home. She'd served for 33 years and most likely felt it was time that she passed the torch to someone else. However, she still continued to visit the home and regularly help the rest of her life until her health no longer allowed for it. And the home continued to flourish long after Lucy's death. After merging several times over the years, it still exists today as Bright Point and helps families with foster care and adoption services as well. Some women, unfortunately, we don't have pictures of, but for this woman, Emily Howard, I can share a picture of some of her artwork that we have in the museum's collection. The city of Bloomington boasts many talented female artists at the turn of the 20th century, and Emily Howard was one of those women. She dedicated her life to not only establishing her artistic identity, but helping people understand that, quote, art has its positive influence not only in developing character, but in making life better and more useful. Emily was one of 7 children born to missionary parents, Reverend Hosea and Teresa Howard, in Burma, which is now the country of Myanmar, in 1836. When Emily was 15 or 16 years old, the family left Burma on account of her parents' poor health. After living in Massachusetts and New York for several years, where she taught music and painting, the family moved to Bloomington in 1858, and she resumed teaching music, giving piano lessons, melodeon, organ, and voice cultivation to young women. By 1869, she taught music, French, drawing, and painting at the Bloomington Female Seminary, operated by Reverend Robert Conover, which at the time was considered one of the prominent educational institutions of Bloomington in that day. Emily showed a talent for painting at an early age, and her skills developed with remarkable success. She continued to hone her skills throughout the rest of her life. She also traveled to the East Coast and Chicago to, quote, refresh herself in a new atmosphere and take a few lessons from eminent artists. She preferred still life painting, focusing on fruit and flowers, and also landscapes, but did dabble in painting human figures occasionally. Her superior skills as a teacher of the arts was recognized and affirmed when she was hired by Illinois Wesleyan University in 1893 to teach guitar. By 1891, she was made the director of the School of Painting and was an instructor of landscape and still life in oil in the Wilson College of Arts at IWU. And her work could be found displayed all over the city of Bloomington, at art shows throughout the region as well. During an 1883 display at the Chicago Art Store at 103 East Front Street, it was noted that pieces she displayed included several landscapes and floral pieces, 2 figure pieces, a Limoges, which is done on porcelain, and 3 paintings in velvet. So it wasn't just the 70s we have to thank for velvet painting, by the way. Howard taught this new method of velvet painting, which became quite popular at the time. She also showed her art in Peoria in May of 1885 at the 6th Annual Central Illinois Art Union exhibit. Admirers of her work one holiday season in Bloomington stated, "It strikes one looking for a beautiful Christmas present that one of these paintings is as appropriate and acceptable as could be found. Many people yearly buy the work of foreign artists, But if they had just seen Miss Howard's, they would have preferred to recognize and encourage home talent instead. Sadly, as Emily grew older, her eyesight began to fail her. Prior to her move to Louisville to live with her sister in 1909, an attempt to preserve her sight through surgery failed, leaving her blind for the rest of her life. However, though a tragic condition for an artist, it was said that she was also cheerful despite her affliction. The museum is fortunate to have two of Emily Howard's paintings in the collection, both still lifes of fruit, and they were on display at the Stevenson House, the boyhood home of Governor of Illinois and U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson II, at the home located at 1316 East Washington Street. Now, this is one of the new women I've included in my presentation this year, also in our rotunda display. So last year, and it hadn't even dawned on me till somebody had mentioned it, I was pointed out that all of the women we featured in my program and in our rotunda display were all Bloomington Normal women. And I was just like, you're right. That's an incredible oversight on my part. So I started reaching out to some of our other historical societies in McLean County, asking, send me your women. Tell me who some of the women from Lexington and Danvers, Hudson, who these women are and what they did to make history. And Nellie Carnahan from Lexington is one of those history-making women. And she was one of the movers and shakers of her time in Lexington. She was a savvy and energetic businesswoman whose career was born of necessity. Not only did she own and operate her own business for 15 years, but she was considered a leader in the business community and religious and social life in Lexington. She sponsored every good cause and worked untiringly for every movement which was in the best interest of Lexington. Nellie Jane Jones was born in Wales, Great Britain, in 1875 to Robert and Rebecca Jones, and when she was an infant, her parents brought the family to the United States and settled on a farm about 4 miles east of Lexington. Her childhood was spent on the farm where she attended local schools and finished her education at Lexington High School. On December 8, 1894, Nellie married Louis O. Carnahan, and they had one son, Charles, who was born about a year later. Unfortunately, December 20th, 1897, Louis contracted tuberculosis and passed away, and he was only 24, and Nellie was only 22, and at the time had a 1-year-old son. What is she gonna do? She has to join the workforce. So prior to opening her own store, she began working at other businesses in Lexington. 3 years before opening her own store, N.J. Carnahan and Company, she gained, quote, much experience in the business world as a saleswoman, working for Miss E.G. Knotts. It was reported that during her employment with Miss Knotts, she mastered every detail of the trade, which well qualified her to assume the responsibility as manager and buyer for her own store. And so in March of 1912, in partnership with another local woman, Clara Farner, they purchased Miss Knott's business and opened up their own shop. N.J. Carnahan and Company was the only exclusive women's store in Lexington. Nellie and Clara kept a large well-stock of items such as dry goods, ladies and children's clothing, aprons, table linens, jackets and cloaks, fancy furs, silk, dressmaking, dry goods, yarn, and more. And they employed competent trimmers and had all the latest fashions on display. Nellie would make regular business trips to Chicago to bring back those latest fashions for all the people of Central Illinois. Because it wasn't just people of Lexington who shopped there. People from Bloomington and throughout the region would go because it was one of the few dedicated women's stores. And she also attended the Retail Merchants Association convention regularly, and the Lexington Unit Journal newspaper dubbed her as one of the most progressive and energetic businesswomen of this section of the state. And she successfully operated that store until June 1927, when she decided, I've had enough of that. But she continued to be an active member of the Lexington community. On February 3rd, 1920, Nellie and 34 other enterprising businesswomen of Lexington formed the Women's Community Welfare Association, which was created with the goal of doing something worthwhile for Lexington. The women saw a need to promote local business, civic, and social life in the community, and she held the position of president for several years. And some of the activities they engaged in included bringing speakers to the area, giving money for summer band concerts, organizing community cleanups, and helping maintain community restrooms, and raising funds for community causes. She was also actively engaged with politics, attending the Republican Women of the 19th Congressional District, and also the Florence Fifer Bohrer Club in Bloomington, which became the League of Women Voters. She was a member of the Lexington Music Club, the Order of the Eastern Star, the Mothers Club, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and served on the grade school board for several years. As aging and health issues set in, she went to live with her sister May in Detroit, Michigan, where she passed away on June 20th, 1943. Her obituary described her as having, quote, an abundant and beautiful life. She teemed with the joy of living, loved people intensely, and were interested in the welfare of everyone. Quite a compliment indeed for Lexington's former businesswoman, the one who made town thrive. And I was able to stumble across a picture on the right-hand side of the screen of Nellie, Louie, and Charles not long before her husband passed away, thus changing her life course. We all know this lady, Angie Milner. Angie, as she was known to most, had a lifelong love of literature, books, and reading. She was born in 1856 to John Vernon and Angeline Milner in Bloomington, and she was a frail girl who was mainly educated at home by her mother, who was a former governess, but also felt the quality of Bloomington schools was lacking as well. And so when she was able to, she did go to public school occasionally, but mainly had that home education. And it was said that she learned the alphabet by the age of 2 and could read by age of 4. Her affiliation with Illinois State Normal University began in August of 1880 with her working at the Illinois State Library of Natural History that was housed on the ISNU campus. It was her job to mount botanical specimens and catalog books. And while working at the library, Angie began studying library science on her own. In 1889, then President Edwin Hewitt was given permission by the Illinois State Board of Education to combine several libraries of books scattered across campus and hire a full-time librarian. And Angie received that recommendation and was officially hired in September 1890 to catalog 4,000 books that ISNU owned that were scattered through 5 different libraries across campus. She began her tenure as librarian with only 1 assistant, and by the end of her career, she had 4 assistants and many students who helped her manage a collection of over 40,000 books and as many periodicals and pamphlets. She had cataloged and written call numbers on each and every volume, and because of her hard work and dedication, the library expanded several times during her tenure. First, in 1892, she got an extra room. In 1898, when it moved to the newly constructed Cook Hall, the Castle building on campus. And then again, in 1914, to the, quote, old training building, which was renamed North Hall. Angie was also a founding member of the Illinois branch of the American Library Association and served various offices, including president. And having developed library science knowledge through experience and self-study, she wrote numerous professional articles and gave many presentations. Because all faculty members required their students to use the library, she developed lessons so that students could become familiar with the library and put it to better use. Her passion for library science drew national attention and helped shape university curriculum. And she was well known to students and faculty and went out of her way to be of service to them. And she was always helpful and spent hours hunting down a reference needed for a thesis. But she had no patience if you waited till the last day that your assignment was due. And she would lecture you if you waited till the last day your assignment was due. And because of all this, she was familiarly known as Aunt Angie by students across campus. In addition to professional organizations, Angie was also a member of several different community groups. She took part in a history and art club, the Women's Club of Bloomington, the American Literature Club, which she founded, the Paladin Club, the University Center, and Equal Suffrage Association. She worked for almost 40 years at the library until ill health forced her retirement in 1927. 10 years after her death, construction began on a new library at ISNU to be named Milner Library in her honor, which now is Williams Hall on campus. It was dedicated on June 10, 1940. The library moved its present location in 1976, and they named it Milner Library, again in her honor. And many of the old books remained in the old Milner Library on the third floor until they were moved to ISU's archives, which is now north of town. I always love the picture of Angie and her books, surrounded by all that knowledge. Elizabeth Irons Folsom Fox, despite being born with poor eyesight and eventually going blind, Lizzie Irons Folsom Fox did not let that disability stop her from having a long and successful writing career. Lizzie was born in 1862 in Peoria to Charles and Eddie Marie Irons. She was the only child, and her parents moved to Bloomington when she was a young girl, and she graduated from Bloomington High School in 1879. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, she was born with poor eyesight. Her mother and her maternal grandparents both battled blindness. This problem would only worsen throughout the rest of her life, although at the time, doctors assured her that the condition would only be temporary and not get worse. After her first marriage ended for unknown reasons, to support herself and her invalid mother, Lizzie began working for the Panagraph newspaper as a court reporter. Her job as a court reporter was not an easy one, especially for women. The job entailed sitting through days of trials. Often she had to go out and catch a cab at 3 a.m. in the morning to get the details of a murder case or try to get to the center of town. But Lizzie often said these years were a necessary foundation for her writing to develop in the years to come. As her eyesight continued to deteriorate, however, she felt less able to do that job and resigned after 14 years. But that was just the beginning of her writing career. Lizzie recounted that she had written her first short story while traveling to Chicago by train in 1914. An idea struck her on the journey, and she put it to paper. When she arrived in Chicago, she sent it off to Munsey's Magazine of New York City, and they bought it. She had no serious expectation of getting the story published, only thought of it as a way to pass the time on the train. Munsey sent her a check, and with that check, requested more stories. Her next 8 stories were sold to the same magazine. It was after that she decided to go to New York City and try to establish herself as a writer. Even though her eyesight was very bad when she first arrived in New York, it did not stop her at all. And she didn't write just one type of story. She published stories on a variety of topics. She described the way she wrote as one that uses real people with unusual personalities and a real setting, but the rest was fiction. She also used her court cases, names changed of course, for inspiration for her stories too. And she was persistent in getting publishers to review her stories and publish them. One of her stories was rejected 35 times before being accepted by the same publisher who rejected it. In all of the first 5 years of her career as a fiction writer, she published about 50 short stories. The highlight of her career came in August 1923 when in 1924 when she won an O. Henry Award for her short story, Towers of Fame. And it was published in McClure's magazine in August of 1923. The award made headlines across the country, and all of her friends and family back in Bloomington took great pride in her achievements. But sadly, the last few of her lives were spent in total blindness, and she was not able to do much writing. Florence Risser Funk, yes, those Funks, was one of McLean County's most renowned suffragettes and society women. She was born in 1871 in Bloomington to Abraham and Mary Risser. When Florence was 6 years old, her father moved the family to Chicago, hoping a larger city would be better for her saddle business. After completing her public school education, Florence enrolled in Vassar College in 1890. She married her childhood sweetheart of Frank Funk in 1895. She and Frank settled in Bloomington and had 3 children, Mary, Benjamin II, and Florence. And Frank was the son of Ben Funk, former mayor of Bloomington. She became involved in a variety of social and cultural activities in Bloomington, including a history and art club, the amateur musical club, the Margaret Fuller Literary Club, but her true calling was community betterment, and she became involved with the YWCA and the Women's Club. Sometime after 1910, however, she began to develop a keen interest in women's suffrage. She was a member of the Illinois Equal Suffrage Association and worked aggressively to press the Illinois General Assembly into passing the Presidential and Municipal Voting Act. And women like Funk made that prevail. And Governor Dunn signed that bill into law into 1913, making Illinois the first state east of the Mississippi to have limited voting rights for women. And now Florence began directing her work to the national level as well. And she was very active in politics. In addition to supporting her husband Frank's political aspirations, she was an ardent supporter of Republican candidate for president of the United States, Charles Evan Hughes, in 1916. Hughes was a supporter of suffrage and won a lot of support from women like Florence. Florence became the Illinois state organizer for the women's branch of the Hughes Alliance, and she helped organize Republican clubs, including local Hughes clubs throughout central Illinois. And thanks to efforts by Florence and the Hughes Alliance, Hughes carried Illinois, but unfortunately was defeated by Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson at the national level. Outside of politics, Florence answered the call of duty in 1917 during World War I, and she did her part to support the war effort by serving on the State Committee of the Women's Council of National Defense that mobilized women for work on the home front and helped raise funds through the Liberty Loan campaigns during the war. And she was a multitasker. She tirelessly supported the war effort, far from abandoned her suffrage work. And she and other members of the Illinois Women's Suffrage Association continued to meet and discuss efforts to pass that national effort, which paid off in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was added to the U.S. Constitution. It's unfortunate, however, that Florence's opportunity to enjoy the nationally won franchise for women only lasted for 3 years because she passed away in 1923. However, she did live to see the first woman elected to serve in the Illinois House of Representatives, which was Lottie Holman O'Neill from Downers Grove in 1922. Another Lexington lady, another star of the stage from locally. I love to sing. I love it better than anything else. If it weren't for my managers, I suppose I'd be giving my services away for free. That's what Laura Withers Biggs, known as Laura Hoffman, on the stage. A McLean County girl who became a renowned opera singer and theater star in the early 1920s, or the early 20th century. After making her debut in the United States in 1916, her successful career on stages throughout the United States, Canada, and Europe spanned over 25 years. She was the only child born to William and Mary Withers. Her talent was recognized when she was just 3 years old. Her parents, teachers, and neighbors afforded young Laura many opportunities to develop her voice through adolescent years, singing at the local church and community activities. And she received training from some of the best teachers in Bloomington and Chicago. From Lexington, Laura Withers went on to attend University of Illinois in 1907, where she was a member of the Alpha Chi Omega sorority. At the end of her junior year, she was given the choice of finishing college or going abroad. In a 1948 Pantograph interview, she stated, "Needless to say, I jumped on the chance to go to Paris." She spent 2 years in Paris studying with Charles W. Clark, and when she returned to the U.S. in 1913, she spent a summer honing her skills singing for various groups in churches in Chicago. In 1914, she surprised friends and family by getting married. She quietly married her childhood friend and neighbor, Charles Biggs, in Chicago. He had also grown up in Lexington, and at the time of their marriage was working a banking job in Chicago. As Laura's career grew, Charles eventually took on the position of being Laura's agent and personal representative. As Laura's Withers' voice carried her into the professional career, advisors suggested she take a stage name. So in the fall of 1916, she chose Laura Hoffman, which was her paternal grandmother's maiden name, and would remind her of her loved ones at home. Laura Hoffman made her American debut at the Aeolian Hall in New York City on October 18, 1916. The New York Evening Mail also proclaimed that she came to the city most unheralded and presented a short program. Nothing further was needed to prove her a real artist, one whom it was a pleasure to welcome to the concert field. Besides her performances in theater around the U.S., during the years surrounding World War I, she gave many programs to entertain the troops. In 1919 came her first engagement in musical comedy, and she began performing with Schubert's theatrical production based in Manhattan, New York. Laura was featured in The Gaieties of 1919, Cinderella on Broadway, and many other performances in those early years. She spoke of one show, Paris edition of Artists and Models, as a career because it lasted 87 weeks. After a long and successful career, Laura decided to retire from the stage in 1941. In retirement, Laura worked as a housekeeper at the Astor Hotel in New York, a house mother for Chi Omega, Michigan, at Michigan State University, who was looking for an emergency replacement house mother. She decided to step in. She also was a house mother at Alpha Sigma Kappa and Kappa Delta sororities as well. Outside of all these activities, she was a 50-year member of the Order of the Eastern Star, a charter member of the Lexington Genealogical Society, which is the Fort today, and the National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And by the early 60s, she returned to Lexington to spend her final years with old friends in McLean County, still continuing to entertain people on local stages. All right, I knew I was gonna run out of time. So I'm gonna, there's some of her pictures and some of her billboards. I'm terrible at clicking ahead. So I will share one more lady, and then we'll have some time for questions. So I'm gonna skip ahead to, oh yeah. So another of the new women in our display for this year is Ruth Biddingham, which some of you may remember Ruth. She was very active in the local DAR chapter, and she was passionate about community and genealogy. Her mother's family, the Merwins, had deep roots in McLean County, and when Ruth and her family returned to Illinois, she wasted no time in becoming involved in her community. Ruth was born in 1915 in Wyoming. She was the firstborn daughter of Frank and Leslie Bidding. Frank and Harriet moved to Central Illinois to take over the 240-acre David Merwin farm in Ellsworth, Illinois. Ruth attended first and second grade here locally, but they were urged to move to Florida, and so they packed up and left. After their family farm down there survived a large fire, but did not survive the Miami hurricane of 1926, they decided to come back to Illinois, maybe where it's a little safer weather-wise. Ruth married Justin Ham on July 22, 1936 in Ellsworth, and the couple soon moved to Hudson to a farmhouse built by James's grandfather. They lived in that house for 50 years and then moved 1 mile down the road to the family farm of his other grandfather. Ruth became an active member of the Hudson community. She became involved in 4-H and served as the leader for the Hudson Girls 4-H group for 10 years. And she watched many of her girls model their award-winning designs at the Illinois State Fair. In 1937, Ruth was invited to join the Hudson Home Bureau unit, and she was a member of that group for 72 years, which included serving one term as chairman. When Ruth moved to Hudson, she had never heard of the DAR. That changed when she was paid a visit by Etta Carruthers, who encouraged Ruth to join the DAR in 1939. And thus began Ruth's active 69-year membership. She belonged to the DAR at the state, local, and national levels and held offices in each of those levels of the organization. When she was interviewed by the Pantograph in 2007 about her service to the DAR, she stated, "My poor husband ate a lot of microwave meals." And because of her outstanding contributions to the Hudson community through state and local activities, Ruth was awarded the first Kenneth Coons Memorial Award in 1977, presented to her by the Hudson Lions Club. She was an accomplished genealogist and published several titles, including Soldiers of the American Revolution, Buried in Illinois, The Bidding Family Now and Then, and The Hudson Colony, for which was a project of the Hudson Bicentennial Commission in 1976. At the time, the village president wrote the following foreword of the book about Ruth's accomplishment, stating, "The compiling of all the facts chronicled in this book represents a great amount of time and effort on the part of the author. It took extensive research of old records and their painstaking study. It was a massive gathering of bits and pieces of information, concentrating them into 2 covers." And Ruth and her husband were very active in traveling, particularly because she was involved in genealogy. It sent them to destinations such as Canada, Iceland, Bermuda, Mexico, the Bahamas, and they spent 3 months visiting European nations, all while they were doing research in genealogy. And Ruth had a good long life of service to her community and the DAR when she passed away at the age of 93 in 2008. And as I mentioned, there's so many more women that I could talk about. Clearly, I had to shorten my PowerPoint a little bit. And all of the women in my PowerPoint are featured in our rotunda display, which is just outside the doors. There's information on our website with all of their biographies that you can read. You can also go through our past cemetery walk biographies for even more women from McLean County. And I always like to pose a question to everyone that I do this program for, is to ask, who was a woman in your life that influenced you? Whether it was your mom or your grandma or maybe somebody famous that you've never even met. Just to kind of think about that for a moment. Who's a woman that impacted you? Because we all have them in our lives. So I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has any. Stunned silence. Oh, there's 2, yay.
Candace, would you name the women you skipped?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I'll just show you. So, Eva Jones, I always love sharing her story because she was just a force to be reckoned with. Frances Kessler, she was the music appreciation teacher at District 87 for many years. Beulah Kennedy, staunch advocate for civil rights locally, one of the founders of the group US that helped improve employment practices at State Farm and get equal housing. And I skipped one of our circus performers too. Marie Antoinette Concello, one of our flyers locally, who also was known for being the first woman to ever do the triple somersault as well. So, all fascinating women, all featured out in our rotunda display or on our website.
My question was if you were going to have another show with the others.
Oh, I mean, I change up my presentation every year. I'm always swapping women out. Because I don't even know how many times I've done this program, but I always try to include at least a few new women. Because some places I go to like every year and do this talk, and that's all right. And I have a Post-it note on my desk that has more women that I want to add to my program, and like ideas for next year's rotunda display, because there's just so many stories to tell, and each of them had an impact in a different way in our local history. I mean, you could. If there was a way I could hang them from below the dome, I would do that, because there's just, it's amazing, all these women and how they've either been forgotten or nobody's ever heard of them. So it excites me when I unearth a new story, like the stories of Laura Hoffman or Ruth Biddingham or Nellie Carnahan. Like, I knew nothing about Nellie and Laura. I knew about Ruth because she was very much a part of the Genealogy Society and the DAR here, but other people, I'm always amazed by what we find.
This is my first one, but I was wondering if you would ever consider doing something on women making history, current people, so we can get educated about what's going on with our current climates.
Yes.
And find other people to follow and things to belong to. If we don't want to be the main person, but we want to follow.
Yeah, no, I do get that question. Why don't you feature women now? And it's like, who would I leave out? You know, I feel like I would miss somebody. Not that I'm not missing people that are important, but also sometimes when you're working with biographical information of a living person, they, you know, might, well, that's not how I remember it, or maybe it should really be this way. Not saying that the research we do here isn't up for historical interpretation too, but it tends to be a little easier of a process when I work on women who have passed away. But that's why I always ask the question at the end, who is somebody that has influenced you? And I'm always hopeful that somebody will mention one of the movers and shakers women that have influenced them in our community now. We did do a program, was it last year? It was last year, where we used women from history to kind of parallel with women who are today active in the community, and those kind of help share their stories to tell what's all happening now. But it's a really good question.
Do we have any other questions, or anyone want to share a woman that inspired them?
All right.
Crickets. Well, thank you, Candace. Let's have a round of applause.
Thank you. And please join us for our next Lunch and Learn in April, organizing the policy change for a more just and regenerative food system with Jeff Hake. That'll be on Thursday, April 10th, right back here, same bat time, same bat channel. Thank you so much.